guess the biggest, or at least from a local entrepreneur perspective, has to be MOL Global with Ganesh. He is an interesting guy. He has a great story to tell. If you listen to his origin story, the way he tells it, he pretty much walked in blind to Tan Sri Vincent's office and said, "I am a startup, give me money." And he got his money during the boom, the early boom in I think it was the 2000s, where tech startups were hot, and the Bajaj Group and Tan Sri Vincent in particular were looking specifically to invest in promising startups. I believe he put in about 135 million across 20 startups. To date, 2 to 3 have survived, and Ganesh's MOL Global was the most visible. And he shared with me the story about how they ended up acquiring Friendster, which was pretty cool. Because the way the story goes is that Friendster was up for sale after years of mismanagement. They were losing all their users to then up-and-coming Facebook. So MOL put in a bid, and so did 2 other companies, one from China and one a US-based firm. So after the second round of bidding, the Chinese firm dropped out. And the owners went back to Ganesh and said, "Would you be willing to buy the company without the patents?" And he said, "Hell no. We want everything lock, stock, and barrel. I've done my due diligence, and the price that we have offered is what the company is worth." So the owner said, "Okay, fine." And by the time the third round came around, because it turns out the second guy still left in the bid was Facebook. So after Ganesh bought the company, he knew that he wanted Friendster for 2 reasons. 1, the user base, and 2, for a foot in the door in the US. Because you go to the Silicon Valley and you go, "Hi, we're from MOL," and they're like, "Who?" But if you go in there and you say, "We're with Friendster," and then you get that brand recognition. So that was the only 2 things they wanted Friendster for. And so after he bought the company, he took the patents and he sold it to Facebook for shares in the company, and a deal which had them be a partner for the first attempt that Facebook did with their own online currency, which I think Facebook credits, but didn't quite work out. But it worked out for Ganesh and for Tan Sri Vincent as well, because when Facebook IPO'd, I think their shares were worth over 100 million. So that was a pretty cool story. As for, was it the most exciting? Yeah. Most exciting. I think since the topic is on media relations, I think the most fascinating case that has happened recently has got to be SecuMe and the Watch Over Me app. So that is, if you're talking about the classic story of how something just went viral and just exploded in terms of mainstream consciousness, Watch Over Me had it all. It read like a Hollywood movie. Sinchi, who joined as a co-founder, was herself a victim of an assault attempt at the curb, and she went quite public about it. She wrote a Facebook post, made it public, and it was shared everywhere. So after that experience, she ended up trying to figure out, how do I help? She was compelled to think, how do I help other women in those types of crises? And she joined SecuMe as a co-founder, and they launched Watch Over Me. So when her story first broke, in the Star, that was the tale, that was the angle, that was the hook. A woman who was a victim of an assault joins a startup to create personal safety apps for fellow women. It was a win. It was like a beautiful story packaged that way. So Star carried the story, it exploded, Chinese press carried it, it went, vernacular press carried it, online sites carried the story as well, and it got a massive amount of publicity with that angle. So that's a great case study if you guys want to look at it in terms of getting that right packaging of your own story about your own startup's vision and mission. The problem that Watch Over Me would have later on, once they're more established in the market, is how do you move that conversation away? Because every story that's told, if you see all the stories about Watch Over Me, it was the same angle. Since she was a victim of an attempted assault and all that. But what happens for them, their challenge is what happens 3 years later down the road when they move on to other apps, other offerings. How do you move the conversation away from the fact that she was an assault victim? So that's their problem. But in the beginning, in the early days of launching the app, and they shot up to the top of the App Store in almost all categories that they were listed under. So that's, for an early stage, that was classic organic viral kind of explosion.
Yeah. So, very interesting question. What's the biggest startup I work with? Because I think every company starts from somewhere, and today my biggest clients are IBM, Lenovo, and I think about all the transitions that they've gone through. But one of the biggest startups that I've ever worked with when I was just starting out was, I don't know how many of you remember this company called Orisoft. Used to be listed on Nasdaq. Does Nasdaq still exist? Sorry, damn long ago. Right, and one of the things that, this was with a previous agency I worked with, our job was to actually get them from a startup to actually listing. And after listing, that's normally how a lot of Malaysians cash out, right, and take their money and run. So we stopped our work after listing. But if you think about an objective-driven campaign, which was get us from here to list, and then so I can take my money and run and then pay you X amount, right?
That was the accident.
That was a wonderful story of that, right? But unfortunately, too many Malaysian startups always think like, how can I IPO and cash out as soon as possible, right? And I think that thinking has shifted. I think this was nearly 12 years ago, 13 years ago, right? I think that thinking has shifted kind of a lot over the past decade, right? And now a lot of owners are thinking, how do I hold ownership in my company and continue to drive it to the next level? And so that's why I think about brands like IBM, who has kept a very steady path of growth and how they've shifted and are constantly reinventing themselves and reinventing their narrative. I just wanted to latch on to something that Gabby talked about. It's the question of what's your story really? Because a lot of people start up by saying, I need to get media coverage, but they don't think about what's the story going to say. What's great about my ad? What's the difference with what I'm offering to what other people are offering? And how is this solving a world problem, right? You've got to ask yourself and think big about what's the problem is my startup is solving before you think about, how am I going to get media coverage, right? Because what people want to cover is not so much your company, yourself, you, or even your product. What they want to cover is why is this thing changing the world? How is it solving a problem? How is this going to shake up the industry? How is this going to make things new or introduce a new way of life for other people, right? And so when I think of IBM, they've had to struggle with this ages, and they made several very ballsy moves. They actually, for example, they sold off their PC division to a Chinese company called Legend, which then took that and formed a new company called Lenovo, right? And said we need to focus on enterprise software. And then they launched a campaign called Smarter Planet, which is, well, how are we going to connect back to this entire generation that's growing up and not hearing about IBM? We need to stand for something new, right? And then now they're on the cusp of, again, reinventing themselves and talking about, in a world of big data and analytics, what role does supercomputer and IBM software play, right? And it's all about trying to bring that problem and making it real and tangible for people who want to feel it. And in that same way, it starts not with how much money you've got to pay off a PR agency to speak to journalists for you. It's about what's the story that you're going to tell first.
Gosh, I've written so many. I can't remember.
But actually, you found it really interesting, and they had a good angle. So just to give us an idea of what.
One that I'm quite partial to was a story I wrote on them when I was still with the Star, and it's a company called SoftSpace. They recently won I think last night was the Apicta Awards. They won Best Financial App, and they won, I think, Best of another category. So when I interviewed them, they had just moved to a new office. They didn't even have their company logo on the wall, and the CEO soon was just apologizing to me. He was like, sorry, we can't take the photo with the, this me and the thing on the wall. And I like them just because it's a strong team. They're very acutely aware of the problem they were solving in the market. And it was all about contactless payments. So SoftSpace, if you're not familiar, they offer something kind of like, I think was it Square, that Jack Dorsey over at Twitter helped found and fund. So it's a little attachment that you put on your phone or your tablet, and it allows merchants to accept credit card payments. So it's a much more affordable solution than getting those credit card terminals from the banks, because that costs you a few thousand. And for small businesses and stuff, it's not feasible. So their mission was to allow everybody to make contactless payments, from the makcik that sells nasi lemak at the pasar malam all the way to to the hairdresser, or maybe even at the 7-Eleven. You know, that's their thing. So I've been watching them grow since that day I met them when I was still at the Star, all the way to the day. And it was, because they were invested, they didn't take any shortcuts. Their hardware that they use, you know, it's tier 1 certified. That means that should the hardware fail, the guys like Visa and MasterCard will actually take on the debt, the liability. So they hopped on a plane to Taiwan, met all these vendors, and got the right hardware for their system. And before that, they made money to fund their sauce-based payment system by redesigning Sake Sushi's ordering platform. So if you've ever been to a Sake Sushi, the ones with the iPads, sauce-based designed that for them. So that's how they got their initial kind of money to pay the bills and keep things going while they were working on their solution. And they're expanding. They got investment in a partnership with MWell Global. They've got, they actually launched in Thailand first and not Malaysia, which is a point of contention for me personally, because it's a typical lament that you guys will face as well, that you're gonna get more love outside your market than in your hometown. That is the issue that a lot of startups here face. How do you convince, you know, never mind the media, but investors and potential users that a homegrown solution is just as good as anything else they can find on the store, app store, or, you know, by other vendors out there. So that partial to SockSpace, just because I've seen them from day one. They're growing, they're expanding, and I hope they do good.
Right. So I guess we've advanced a lot in the public relations industry, and I think if you speak to a good PR agency right now, a lot of times what they'll be focused on is your business objective, and that's how we've shifted sort of the thinking in PR over the past 10 years and what I'm really working on right now. I don't have a real Malaysian story to tell. The first startup that I worked with was in Malaysia was, can't remember the name of the startup, I can remember the name of their product. How many of you know this product called WaiterPad? It's still around. So basically what they do is they used to sell Palm Pilots, right, that allow you to take, like, you know, some mamas even have it, right? Take orders, right, and then it hits a terminal, and then automatically your order gets printed out and all that. So that was my first client, and they were just breaking in. And I remember it was about going to talk to some of the local businesses and trying to work on a story together with them on why they're adopting this technology. And it was a lot of work, not from the sense of just coming out with a story angle or convincing a journalist to write about it, but also helping the client look at potential partners to deploy this, working with them, talking about the story, coaching them to tell their story properly, and then finally bringing in the journalists to talk about it. And that was interesting for me because, you know, they're still around. But as we move on, one of the things that we've talked about, and this is interesting because we just did this in Australia about a year ago, is that when we worked with this startup in Australia called Ninefold. So they're a cloud storage agency. They're a cloud storage company, and what they do is they don't just want to target or go after people like Dropbox and Box, which are the consumer cloud storage companies, but they want to target small medium enterprises. And in one particular instance, the kind of enterprise that they want to target are advertising agencies, because they've discovered that it's actually a very good use case for advertising agencies who want access to loads and loads of storage, being able to transfer large files. So there are very specific use cases. For example, you need like final approval on a TV ad. That's huge amount of data, right? And you're not just going to use like WeTransfer or Hightail to get it to your client, right? You want to have something that's more proprietary, more encrypted, and a lot more secure and reliable, right? To make sure that on the 11th hour when something needs approval, it gets through. So that's the solution that Ninefold had created. And when they approached us in Australia, they said we have $10,000 budget, Australian dollars, right? Please don't do conversion. It doesn't work that way, right? So they are paying in their money for the services that are rendered. And typically, when we look at that $10,000, what can we get for you, right? The first reaction of any PR agency is to say, okay, let's draw up a list of media targets that we can target that would reach out to advertising agencies, because advertising agencies would be these kind of publications, right? Maybe marketing magazine, like Gabby used to edit, right? Or Campaign Asia or whatever. And that would have been a typical way a PR agency would have solved your problem. But the team in Australia didn't think that that was the best way and the best use of their clients' money. And what they said was, you know what, there's a better way for us to do this for you. And what they essentially did is they looked at who were the top 30 advertising agencies in Sydney, right? And they said like, look, this is where you really want to be because Sydney is where all the headquarters of every top ad agency in the country. Number two, they looked at who in Sydney, in these ad agencies, were actually the people that were most likely to buy. Because normally what's going to help you as a startup start your first sale is to be able to get a face-to-face meeting with the right person, right? And that's often a barrier. And so in our case, we are a PR agency, but we think, how do I get you past that door? And how do I get you to a face-to-face with whoever you got a solution for? So we looked at IT directors, IT managers in all of these agencies, and we said, are they on Twitter? Are they on Facebook? Can we create a game for them to play and engage with? And so we did. What we did was we created a mystery box and we challenged agencies. So one of the things that we discovered with agencies is that they love to compete with one another. So we say like Rap Collins versus Mumbrella 360. Today is your challenge day. Do you accept your challenge? And you know what? These guys always say accept. So there were 10 challenges run. Every 10 accepted. All of them, in fact, on the last day, there was one agency that said, hey, we haven't been invited yet. Do we get a chance? And I said, sorry, no. Right, but there was enough budget, and you know what we spent the money on? We spent the money on $500 bar tabs, because the other thing that we realized about agencies, and in particular Australian agencies, is that they love to drink. So it would be a treasure hunt.
They drink here too.
Yes, I know. I'm well aware of that. No, not quite as much because our syntax is so high. So, cut the long story short, what this actually got them to, what we challenged agencies to do was to get on Twitter, get on Foursquare, and hunt around Sydney for a box, right? And it's just a plain white cube, and inside that cube would be the voucher if they got there first, before the other agency, with the bar tab. And it would specify a bar somewhere in Sydney where they could redeem that for, and everyone could have drinks, right? What they didn't know was we actually put spy cameras to around that cube, right? And we did all kinds of other things, like we went up to their offices and sprayed graffiti on it, like say, you know, take the challenge if you're there, blah, 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 right? And what happened was they competed, they got the cube, but we hadn't told them who the cube was. And so here was the kicker, right? Ninefold had already paid to attend a conference where all these agencies would be, like big ad conferences, right? You get to be a speaker, right? And what they did was, as soon as they got up on stage, rather than showing your typical boring product presentation, right? What they did was, they played back videos of senior agency people running around Sydney looking for the cube. And the people in the audience recognized their faces on the screen and said, wow, that's me. Who's this funky agency that I need to talk to? And so, interesting metric, out of the 10 agencies that we had targeted, 9 set up next day conversations with Ninefold, and Ninefold actually made something like $160,000 of sales on a $10,000 investment after that. So, long story short, what's the point? Sorry, this isn't about getting media coverage, this is about getting attention. I think it's really about understanding who your audience is and who really is the gatekeeper to the success of your product, right? And there's so many of you here, and all of you have different stakeholders and different audiences that you need to target in order to make your product successful. But I think the thing a smart agency or a smart partner will help you do is to think around what's the best way to get success, and not look at the budget as the main barrier, but think, how do we make use of a small budget and turn that and use that in the best possible way we can to get what you need, you know, to get you to achieve your goal.
So just to add on to what David mentioned, you know, about it was supposed to be about getting media coverage, but there are other things we doing money. When startups approach me, one of the first questions I ask is, are you ready for publicity? Yeah. Do you need it? Because as a startup, you know, you think to yourself, you know, attention would be the validation of the work I'm doing. And the natural thought is that, you know, I gotta get a write-up in the newspaper or a website and stuff. But you have to first ask yourselves, what is the objective? So when I talk to startups and we talked about your media strategy moving forward, at each stage of your startup life cycle, you're gonna have different reasons for talking to people like me. So in the beginning, you know, say your first launch, you're in a beta phase, or you just launched to the public, and say you're in a stage where you're looking for investment. You want investors to come on board who believe in what you're doing and to give you the funding you need to go all the way. So you won't target, you know, things like Marie Claire magazine or even mainstream papers. You want to target, sites like E27, Tech in Asia, or even Digital News Asia, because our audience would comprise of venture firms, investors, angel investors, and guys like that who would read sites like ours, because that's their way of window shopping, what's new in the market and stuff like that. When you get further along and you come to the stage where your goal is user acquisition, that's when you talk to the mainstream press or the more consumer-facing ones. So people ask about, how do you pitch to journalists and stuff like that. Apart from what is your story, you also have to have an understanding of what the publication is about, because that will lower the friction for you with whatever journalist. Because unfortunately, my profession and my fellow peers, we all got a bit of an ego. So we don't like it if you get our names wrong. We don't like it if you have no idea what we're about as a publication. For example, if you pitch like a car story to a beauty magazine, the beauty editor is going to look at you and go,
I'm sure there's a way to pitch it.
I'm sure you can,
There's a nice angle to it.
You could spin it, best way is to apply makeup in the car in the jam or something. You could spin it that way. But first and foremost, you have to form your narrative. What is your angle? Why should we care about you? Is it because your own personal story has the elements of, the heartstring tuggers, the sob story that I worked and saved up, or I had a relative who suffered from this disease, so now I've built a product that will help others like me. What is the human interest element? Because at the end of the day, we are looking for a story. We're not looking so much at your product, and most of us, pretty much all of us, do not care if you succeed or fail, really. But what we are looking for is something interesting to tell our readers about, be it a heartbreaking tale or something that's truly interesting that could be that kind of shareable, like, hey, you should check this out because I think it's cool and I think you'll think it's cool too. So you have to think about that. So at each stage of your startup cycle, you can actually already see in your mind the kinds of outlets, TV stations, radio, or magazines and newspapers and sites that you would want to talk to. So say in the beginning, there'll be guys that hit the investors, and then as you move along, you're ready to the next stage of growth. You look at the publications that your target audience would be reading. So you approach that. And then when you approach a journalist or an editor, be sure to have all your materials ready. Newsrooms are shrinking around the globe. Most publications work on extremely lean teams, and we don't always have the time to sit down with you or be on the phone and have you listen to you explain your story. So I see a very big difference when I get approached from startups from, say, Singapore or once even from Israel, in how prepared they are to seek media attention. So you gotta have your press kit ready. You gotta have your company profile. You gotta have your bios of the founders. You gotta have all your materials, mugshots, high res or mid res, depending on whether it's print or online, photos of your product, screenshots, or some lifestyle shot. Lifestyle shots means like a guy using your app, or an action shot of that sense. You send all that in that single email with a short brief, and then if you have a press release, your press release should be about what's the message. What are you trying to say to people? What is and keep it, David, you can back me on this, like, you can't have too many messages in one release, right? It has to be one or maximum two things. Yep. And you have to focus on that. So be prepared in that sense. You have to spend some time. I know in the beginning, you're too busy running around, you're pretty much running on fumes, you're worried about how to pay rent or payroll or get investor funding in. But at the end, it's all these things. You still have to think about your media strategy, your publicity strategy, because after you're done pitching to investors, you're gonna need to eventually at some point, apart from the cool stuff you can do with a $10,000 budget, eventually at some point you're gonna have to talk to journalists. And the conversation you have with an investor, there's some overlaps, but it's very different from a conversation you have with a journalist. So you have to be prepared to have that conversation. And to a large extent, spoon feed them if necessary with all the materials that they need to write a story or to do a broadcast segment.
That's really interesting. So Text100 actually, we got our start working with a lot of technology PR firms, right? So big office in San Francisco and New York. And we actually founded, and not many people knew this, we actually founded to start working and helping Microsoft in 1982 in the UK. So when they launched in the UK, that's where our founders actually started a PR agency to help them with their work there, and they were a startup at that point in time. How we've often helped startups, and a lot of times when startups approach us, the first thing is for us to, all the things that Gabby said, sometimes it can be really overwhelming. Like, how do you know who's the best journalist to engage, right? You can hit or miss. Grab a Gabby Go, and she ignites and burns you, that's it. Not that you burn anyone. Right, I'm just joking. Who has that knowledge? How do they craft that strategy
Target the right
approach?
right?
But she also mentioned a heck of a lot of things, like get a press kit ready, and that's normally where we start, right? We ask ourselves, what is the information that you have already in written form? How many of you guys have a website? Right? Who writes all your web copy? Do you write it yourself, or does a web agency do it? Depends, right? And when I ask a startup that question, some of them are incredibly talented. They write it all by themselves. Some English not so good, have to hire a copywriter, right? And it's gonna be the same way for each and every person when you're asking yourself, do I need to hire a PR agency? Because there are